Reading Chapter 2b of Swift Rivers by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 2 is titled Forest Treasure, starting on page 45. When the fruits ripened year by year, globes of silvery green turning to gold and yellow-brown, the children who played below its branches still sang the song that the first bold pioneer had taught them, and old Alexis Dahlberg, with his faint, wrinkled smile, loved always to talk of it as his little nut tree. The snow began to be firmer underfoot as Chris advanced up the valley, so that he seemed finally to be making fairly rapid advance along the twisting road which followed the river. On either side, the fields lay buried deep under their smooth blanket of white. With what heavy labor each one of these sloping acres had been carved out of the forest, with what toil men had tilled and mowed them, so that the woods would not creep forward and take possession of them again. Grandfather had had his share in clearing those lands, although his work had been broken by his voyages upon the seas of all the world. Grandfather's was a soul always thirsting for adventure. It was strange with what courage and patience he faced the quiet and loneliness of the life he must lead now. With every step, Chris felt himself developing and strengthening that purpose of making Alexis Dahlberg safe and happy for such years as remained to him. The wide door of Caspar Goddard's blacksmith shop was open as he passed, with the red glow of the fire showing from within. Caspar called to him to come in and eat, for it was nearing noonday. Chris answered cheerily that he must travel further before he made his midday stop, thanked his good friend without pausing, and tramped on, his snowshoes making their steady, soft shuffling in the snow. He was reflecting whether he should pause at Jan Peterson's house or try to continue even farther, when a sudden turn of the road brought him upon one who was traveling the Goosewing Valley also that day, and who had decided, too, that it was time for the noonday rest. This other had come down the same crooked road that Chris was ascending. Instead of turning into one or another of the farm lanes to knock at some hospitable door where he would certainly have found friendliness and welcome, he had chosen to stop by the wayside, make a little fire in the snow, brew a cup of coffee, and fry bacon out of the provisions from his opened pack. The snowshoes which he had taken off were stuck upright in the drift beside him. The man looked up as the boy came close, made a sign of greeting, and said briefly, "So you are obliged to take the road also, even though the going is none too good. Sit down and eat. There's plenty for two." Chris had been supplied with food by the kindly Brasks so that he could open his own pack and add bread and dried beans to the meal. They sat on their heels in the snow on opposite sides of the fire, eyeing each other, in quick occasional glances across the fluttering orange flames. The man was tall and big-limbed and dressed in just such rough woolen clothes as every farmer or woodsman in that region would wear. His fur cap was pulled well down about his ears, but it showed enough of his face to reveal that his skin was of cloudy copper, scarcely darker than sunburn, while his features were unmistakably that of a red man. He spoke with a trace of French in his tone and words, and he moved with lithe ease and silence, as an Indian would. His fire was the small, intense blaze that an Indian always builds. His dress, his manner of speech, and his easy, friendly smile made it clear that he was, in part at least, a white man, while everything else, from the cut of his high-cheeked face to his moccasined feet, indicated with equal plainness what a portion of him was Chippewa Indian. When they had finished eating, he took out a small black pipe, stuffed it full, and fell to smoking. He asked Chris a few questions, putting his queries with the confidence of one who used to authority and having a right to expect direct answers. The boy answered, shyly at first, then eagerly. He told about grandfather, although he slipped over that dark passage of his life which he had to do with Uncle Nels. He spoke of his determination to take care of grandfather now, and the other nodded. That was how it should be, he agreed. But how was it to be done? In courteous return, the traveler gave some scant information of himself. He was Pierre Dumenel. He did not live in these regions, very far from it. He was a pilot, a raft pilot, on the big Mississippi, some hundreds miles away. Several times he had journeyed back into the hills to see the people of my mother, but he had never taken the way down through Goosewing Valley before. When you have learned to handle a canoe in these rushing mountain streams, it is not so difficult to manage larger craft in the great rapids of the big river, he ended. It was very clear now who were the people of my mother, the quick brown Chippewa who dwelt in the woods to the northward, where the white men had not yet penetrated, the red men who had no use for horses, but did all their traveling in bark canoes upon the myriad waterways of their lake and forest country. Yet, as Chris watched him, he seemed less and less like an Indian. There was something smoldering behind those dark eyes, which looked so steadily across at Chris, some depth of feeling which a red man would never show. The boy, forgetting his shyness entirely now, put a pressing question of his own. If Pierre Dumenel knew something of rafting logs, could he say whether there was anything practical in the plan of cutting timber in these hills and floating it down to the Mississippi? Yes, the other answered quickly, lifting his eyes to the dark crown of pines which ran along the snowy ridges above them. No one has ever tried it before, but some things must always have a beginning. Already logs are beginning to be somewhat scarce on the banks of the great streams. This Goosewing River must be large in flood when the spring comes. But it will need a bold spirit to carry that venture over the first 100 miles. Once you get to the big river, where Shreve McLeod makes up his rafts to send to St. Louis, then, he flashed a quick smile which was entirely French, then it might be my turn to take your wares farther to the market at St. Louis. He got up, showing himself of such tremendous height that even tall Chris felt small beside him. With the ease of smooth strength, he picked up his heavy pack and settled it in its place before he slipped into the thongs of his snowshoes. Good luck to you if you set yourself to this brave undertaking, he said. May such a journey have better success than mine has had. That dark, troubled look which had been visible in his eyes suddenly clouded his whole countenance. Was it because he had liked the boy's honest, open face? Or was it because the pain within him was so great that he must speak out to a total stranger more easily than to a friend? I took my way into the hills, trusting to them to ease a great hurt, he said with queer abruptness. I hoped to forget that I had quarreled with my dearest friend, but I did not leave that memory behind me. He walked away without another word. Chris stood watching until a turn of the road hid him from view, with nothing left but the long-stemmed ovals of his snowshoe prints in the soft white. The boy turned about and took his own way upward, his mind humming and buzzing with a cloud of new thoughts. Logs, the Mississippi, St. Louis. One glorious plan after another went sweeping through his mind. He and Grandfather would cut timber on these hillsides, which were actually in part Chris Dahlberg's own. Chris would take them downstream with the rushing spring waters. He would come to that vast, faintly imagined river, the tremendous Mississippi. Its broad highway rolled past farms and towns and finally came to that city where all things were, even schools and learning. If he should journey afar on that great smooth road, what might he not find at the end of the way? Grandfather had fared on even farther voyages. Grandfather's blood and that of 100 older Vikings ran hot in Chris Dahlberg's veins that morning. He went gaily and lightly up to the wooded trail on the last rise of the way. At the head of the slope he saw a figure moving against the trees. Alexis Dahlberg come out to meet his grandson. He had evidently heard from Eric Knudsen of the affair of Nels Anderson, for his first words were, "So that little matter is ended at last, and new things are beginning? What days we shall have! What days we shall have together now." Before the fire that night they talked a little of Stuart Hale and of what he had said concerning the wealth in this north country. Chris told also of his meeting with the French Indian, Pierre Dumenel, and his opinion in the same matter. Yet the boy said very little of his definite hope to embark on such a venture. He must have time to think it over within his own mind. The snow had come before its time and presently melted away in the soft, hazy warmth of interrupted autumn. On the plea that he must get it in meat for the winter supply, Chris set forth, a few days later, on a long hunting expedition back into the untouched forest of the hills and valleys north of them. He said nothing, even yet, to Grandfather of how his real object was to examine the trees. He marched and camped for a day and a half in soft Indian summer weather. As he journeyed, he met one or two friendly Chippewa hunting deer and elk, and from them he learned more of the woods than he could ever have discovered alone. They also had need of timber, straight, slim trunks for lodge poles, wood for canoes, bows, and lances. They could tell him of individual monarchs of the forest seeming to be as old as time itself, which quick Indian eyes and unfailing Indian memories had marked as the hunters went through the woods. We do not like them too thick, they observed, since primitive tools made cutting the greater trunks a difficult undertaking. In the mixture of signs and sparse words by which they could talk to white men, they told him something of that adventurer Stuart Hale, who had been over much this same ground 2 moons ago. Stuart had come upon one Chippewa village, Chris was told, where all the people had sickened with a strange fever, so that the men could not hunt, or the women tend to them or care for the wailing children. The masterful white youth had forced the sick and protesting warriors to rise from their beds and move the camp to a high, windy ridge where clean water poured past them from a mountain top. The village would long remember the miracle of recovery which followed his efforts, nor would its men soon forget the scornful reproofs which, even with his scant knowledge of their tongue, he heaped upon them for setting their encampment in a wet, unwholesome swamp. In another Chippewa settlement, however, he had fallen into a fearful quarrel with a young chief, who had thought him too arrogant and had vowed to have his life. Some of the older men, who had taken a liking to the white lad, forced the unwilling Stuart into a canoe and carried him bodily down the river. They smuggled Pharaoh after him under cover of the night and bade the boy take care that he never came into that neighborhood again. Chris listened, feeling friendship warm and strong within him as he heard these tales of a strange young wanderer who had slipped in and out of his life so quickly. He had gathered sufficient knowledge of the forest country, he decided finally, and set his face homeward on the third day. Eric Knudsen was to stay with his grandfather for a portion of the time, but by now would have gone back to his own house. The boy at last made a halt for food and a brief rest on a rocky hillside, just where the woodland stopped abruptly and where the land beyond fell away in a barren, stony slope. He was gathering wood for his fire when a curious stone caught his eye, close behind the rotted branch which he had stooped to pick up. He moved from shadow into sunshine to examine the thing more closely as it lay in his hand, and felt a strange, tingling thrill run through him as he saw that it was shot through with brilliant yellow. He looked diligently all about his feet, caught another tawny gleam, and then dropped on his hands and knees to search frantically amongst the dry sticks and the drifted leaves. He found one more glittering pebble lying at the very edge of the stony waste, and without hesitation jumped up and ran forth upon the barren slope to search in blind and frenzied excitement for further treasure. It was gold. It must be gold. He resolutely refused to think it could be anything else. He had discovered what others had scoured the hills to seek, but had failed to find. There was a strange rattling all about him, growing to a roar. The whole hillside was a slope of loose shale, almost as unstable as quicksand. The stones slipped away beneath his feet as he fell and slid headlong, a great mass of loose rock sliding with him in a fierce clatter and a choking cloud of dust. He snatched for support in every direction but plunged downward faster and faster, sprawling and helpless. He could not tell how far he might have fallen when he brought up against some solid obstacle with a thump that took his breath away. When the dust had settled about him and the whirling stars had disappeared from before his eyes, he sat up very cautiously and looked about. The great sliding mass which he had brought down with him had split upon a solid outcropping of firm, red rock. Just below, but well outside of his reach, he could see a whole drift of the same glittering stones which had tempted him into such unexpected peril. He hung over the edge of the perch of safety and studied them long and carefully. They lay there flashing and winking in the sunlight. They shone with that strange romantic magic which surrounds even the very dream of gold lying free to be gathered by men's hands. He could not possibly reach the prize without trusting himself once more upon an even steeper and more insecure slope than that down which he had fallen. Many yards below, the steep incline dropped to a perpendicular fall, so that to step on that frail footing seemed to promise almost certain death. But the hard brightness of the shining yellow stones seemed to promise also the trail to certain riches. He never knew how long he hung there, weighing decision in the balance. Such a confusion of jostling thoughts went through his mind. Prosperity, comfort, and security for grandfather. Nels Anderson's sour dismay and regret over breaking with someone who had reached out his hand to glorious wealth. Yet, on the other hand, there was grandfather waiting in the cabin alone, an old man grown perilously dependent upon the presence of a younger and stronger comrade. What would be Alexis Dahlberg's delight on seeing Chris come home with his hands full of proof of sudden riches? Yet, what would be his plight if his grandson never came back at all? And then, for the very first time, there returned to his excited mind the recollection of Stuart Hale's words as he had shown him, amongst his samples of iron and copper, the darkly shining stones. Fool's gold! At this time, gold had not yet been found in California, the loose treasure which was washed out of the riverbeds, news of which set the world on fire with excitement. But men were even then looking, as they had looked ever since the first voyager stepped upon American shores, for gold which was to be had for the picking up, riches without effort. Chris reached deep into his pocket and pulled out that first stone which his wandering friend had given him. Yes, it was like the one he had just found. Yet, in his first fever of discovery, he had forgotten the very existence of Stuart Hale. What was there about gold which made a mere flash of yellow set a man quite out of his wits? Chris had forgotten everything, even his grandfather and the great new venture, all for that sudden wink of brightness amongst the leaves. He had heard of one or two old prospectors who had gone seeking into these very hills and who had never come back. Had they laid their bones at the foot of that steep abyss into which he himself had almost fallen? Had not Stuart Hale said something of risking his life for the possession of his own sample of yellow mineral? He must have gathered it at this very place. Very carefully, Chris studied the slope above him, making out a small foothold here and there, a twisted bush rooted in the stone, or a small outcropping of the same rock upon which he stood. He turned about cautiously and prepared to attempt the climb upward. It was a hideous journey as he crawled face downward on a long, crooked slant across the expanse of the hillside. Once and then again he slid a few yards in a breathtaking rush of clatter and dust, but, spread prone as he was, he did not slip far and was again able to make painful headway upward. It seemed that he had been struggling for hours before he finally reached the edge of the waste, laid hold of a poplar sapling, and stood once more with firm ground beneath his feet. He could scarcely believe that the sun had passed only an hour's space beyond the high tide of noon. So long and perilous had seemed the time which he had spent in that difficult passage. His knees were trembling a little as he set to the task of building his fire and frying his bacon.